Welcome to the Possibility Action Network podcast. I'm Dr. Stephen Middleton, also known as Possibility Man, sharing stories of hope, resilience, and possibility. Today, I want to share on the theme the Industrial Building and Savings Company. Some of you may have heard of that institution. It operated in the United States from 1885 to roughly 1900. And I want to take you back to that period when the Industrial Building and Savings Company was born. It was 1884, 1884 in the United States. More than 4 million Black Americans had recently been emancipated from slavery. After 1865, there had been some progressive movement on their behalf. The 13th Amendment, for example, the amendment which abolished slavery, had been adopted by Congress and put into effect. The 14th Amendment had been adopted and put into effect. And also the 15th Amendment had been adopted by the Congress of the United States and put into effect in this country. In addition to those constitutional amendments, there were a few civil rights legislation that had been passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 established citizenship for Black Americans and also gave them the right of entering into contracts and enforcing those contracts in court. In fact, the 1866 Civil Rights Act was a predecessor of the 14th Amendment, which also confirmed citizenship. And then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which theoretically gave Black people access to public facilities. These were all progressive legislation. And under them, for the first few years after emancipation, Black Americans were doing pretty well politically. The United States, for example, needed their vote in order to restore the Union, so they enfranchised Black men. Because of this, throughout the South, in places like South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Black people, for the very first time in U.S. history, were elected to Congress. I can imagine how the two senators who were elected from Mississippi might have felt the first time they entered that august body. And then the representatives, over about 20 years, approximately 20 of them had been elected from various states in the South. So immediately after slavery, it appeared that Black Americans were doing pretty well politically. They were in the House of Representatives, they were in the Senate of the United States. Many of them were in the legislatures of the state governments. And then 1876 came, that disputed election, where the United States struck a compromise with the Democratic Party. That is, the Republican Party struck a compromise with the Democratic Party. And that began the erosion of Black political participation in the United States government. Republicans were still in power for the most part until 1884, when Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, was elected president of the United States. Cleveland sided with many of the Democrats in the South who wanted to achieve politically the political domination of Black people. So therefore, in cities across the country, Black leaders began to say, we cannot rely on the national government to help us. The little bit of support we had gotten before 1884 had been gone. They had to look to themselves. And in places like Washington, D.C., it was not the only one, Black people began to come together, began to organize, began to ask themselves, what can we do to help ourselves? What type of strategy can we pursue to uplift our communities? One of them, Andrew F. Hillier, kept records of their early meetings. And Hillier noted that some members of Congress even mocked Black people. They were saying things like, they don't, that is, Black people did not control any financial institutions. No matter what they said about politics, they were not building institutions of their own. So, therefore, in Washington, D.C., in 1885, a committee of 11 men came together. Those individuals included Milton M. Holland, who was a Civil War veteran who had won the Medal of Honor in the Civil War. He also was employed in the Treasury Department of the United States, was a very accomplished individual. Leonard C. Bailey was another one of them. Bailey was a barber. And also in DC, he established 5 barbershops. He was also an inventor. He attended this meeting. And then there were some physicians. Dr. Charles Purvis, who was a surgeon and also a professor of medicine at Howard University Medical School. He was joined by another physician, Furman Shad, who also taught at Harvard. These and some of the other bright leaders in Washington came together. They had one question that they put to this committee that I like to call the Committee of 11. They said, what type of strategy can we employ to lift Black people out of poverty into a level of prosperity? How can we help them save money? How can we help them acquire homes? What can we do? In 1885, then, they conversed around that subject. What can we do? What can we do? And in their discussions, they remembered that before the Civil War, Black Americans had established mutual aid societies. These were self-help initiatives. When individuals, for example, needed to be buried, they thought that, look, we need to have access to capital, our own capital, because the state and the communities that we lived in would not help us. They began to form these societies, inviting members to contribute their nickels, their dimes, and their dollars. So therefore, when one of them died, they had funds available to bury their family members. When widows or children needed resources, basic, necessities, that fund was available to them. The Committee of 11 recalled this model, and they wanted to develop an institution built upon that model. They were not the only ones, by the way, who were exercising self-help initiatives. Many Europeans were doing the same thing at the time. So as they looked at the Grover Cleveland administration, they concluded once again, we will not get any help from them. We cannot count on the government. We must count on ourselves. Andrew Hillier reported. Then it was Milton Holland who asked, what can we do to be saved? And the Committee of 11 responded, establish an organization that will produce economic development in our community. And this is where they decided to establish the Industrial Building and Savings Company. And this institution was the one that they began to shepherd in the late 1800s into the 1890s to ask Black people to contribute their nickels, their dimes, their dollars. so that they, in turn, could come to the Industrial Building and Savings Company to obtain funds to buy homes, to borrow money in case of need, to borrow money to establish businesses. This cooperative venture was highly successful. In fact, in 1893, when the Great Depression hit the United States and forced many financial institutions into closure, the Industrial Building and Savings Company survived it. A local black newspaper, referred to as the Washington Bee, said that the IBSC outdid the Depression. They survived the Depression. They began to accumulate money. And by the way, I forgot to mention their first president was Frederick Douglass, who was a very prominent American at the time. And the leaders of the Industrial Building Savings Company felt that Douglass would stamp this organization with his reputation. And of course, many people would be drawn to it. Well, by the early 1890s, let me just look to my notes to get one stat for you, one or two stats for you. They had accumulated by 1893 $131,000. Now, this is 1893 money. Today, if you check this, 1893 money today would be roughly $5 million. Now, think about it. Many of these individuals had been enslaved. Many of these individuals were making nickels and dimes, but they were able to pull together, in today's dollars, over $5 million today. They made out loans in 1893 up to $60,000. Today, this would be like $2.3 million. In 1893, they were able to loan money for people to buy homes for the very first time. They were able to support businesses throughout Washington, D.C. They were able to support educational programs in Washington, D.C. where this cooperative existed. So once again, they identified a problem and they sought a strategy to solve it. And for 15 years in Washington, they were highly successful. As the new century began, the Industrial Building Savings Company began to fade. As new institutions open up, as big mainstream institutions open up, people have other choices to deposit their monies. The Industrial Building and Savings Company just went out of business. But looking back in the 1890s, I'm telling you, I am simply inspired by what they had accomplished. They did what many felt was impossible. So as I close today, I want to ask you, what challenge do you face personally as an individual? And I want to follow up by asking, what is your strategy for solving it? Everyone needs a strategy. Talking about it is not going to do it. What's your strategy? If you live in a community and you identify problems in your community, again, I want to ask, what is your strategy for solving it? Talking alone will not accomplish it. Hey, if this podcast resonates with you, share it to someone, drop me a message, subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think about all of this. Together, let's create more. I'm Stephen Middleton from the Possibility Action Network, also known as Possibility Man, sharing stories of hope, resilience, and possibility. Until next time, good day